May 23, 1857. Appalachian Mountains, slave-era Kentucky. Silas Mercer wrapped a chain around a living man's throat in a cellar beneath his cousin's farmhouse, while Ruth Crowley stood 3 feet away, writing the man's name into a leather notebook, like she was recording the weight of a slaughtered hog. The man was a Methodist preacher. He had been praying 10 minutes ago. Now he was entry number 12.
2 20-year-old cousins had turned the Appalachian Mountains into a private killing ground, butchering travelers for 2 years, and no one heard a single scream. The mountains swallowed everything. If this story satisfies your curiosity for the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to the channel and follow this story to the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Thomas Whitaker had been sheriff of Perry County for 11 years, and in all that time he had never once failed to find a missing man. Dead or alive, drunk or drowned, he always brought somebody home. But by the spring of 1857, Thomas Whitaker could not sleep. He sat at his desk past midnight, staring at a growing list of names, and every single one of them ended the same way. Vanished. No body, no witness, no explanation. 12 men, he said out loud to no one. 12 men don't just walk off the face of God's earth. But in eastern Kentucky, in the years before the Civil War tore America apart, men disappeared all the time. Slaves ran north and got caught or got killed. Poor white settlers drifted west, chasing promises that never materialized. Preachers rode into hollows and never rode out because typhoid or cholera or a rattlesnake got them first. Death was ordinary in the mountains. Nobody counted. Nobody cared. Except Thomas Whitaker cared, because these 12 men were not runaways. They were not drifters. They were merchants with families. A doctor riding to treat the sick, a hardware dealer heading south, a preacher with a congregation waiting for Sunday. Respectable men, known men, men whose wives sent letters begging for answers, and every single one of them had vanished along the same 20-mile stretch of trail threading through a place the locals called Black Hollow Ridge. Whitaker's deputy, a young man named James Boone, stood in the doorway one morning and said what everyone else in town was too afraid to say. "Sheriff, folks are talking. They say something lives up in that hollow, something that ain't human." Whitaker looked at him hard. "Something lives up there, all right, but it's human, James. That's what scares me." He was right to be scared, but he did not yet understand how right he was. The first disappearance happened in the autumn of 1855. A merchant named Cornelius Pratt left Hazard with a mule loaded with dry goods, heading south toward the slave-holding counties where there was money to be made selling supplies to plantation owners. Cornelius kissed his wife, told her he would be back in 6 days, and rode into the mountains. 6 days passed, then 10, then 30. His wife, Martha Pratt, walked into the sheriff's office with red eyes and trembling hands. "He would not leave me," she said. "Not willingly, not ever." Whitaker organized a search. They found the mule wandering near a creek bed, still carrying every item Cornelius had packed. The goods were untouched. The money pouch was still tied to the saddle. Nothing was stolen. Cornelius Pratt was simply gone. "Robbery doesn't leave the money behind," Whitaker told his deputy. "A man running from his life doesn't leave his horse." 3 months later, a doctor named Henry Alcott rode out to treat a typhoid outbreak in a settlement near the ridge. He never arrived. His medical bag was found hanging from a tree branch, carefully placed, as if someone had set it there with deliberate hands. His horse was found grazing a mile away, calm and unbothered. Again, nothing stolen, Again, no body. By the summer of 1856, the disappearances were coming faster. A hardware dealer, 2 traveling merchants from Virginia, a young surveyor mapping land boundaries for a county that was still arguing over where its borders fell. Every time, the pattern was identical. The victim entered the 20-mile corridor around Black Hollow Ridge. Their belongings were found, their animals were found, but the men themselves dissolved into the mountain air, as if they had never existed. Whitaker pinned a map to his wall and drove a nail into every location where belongings had been recovered. When he stepped back and looked at the pattern, his blood went cold. Every nail formed a circle. And at the dead center of that circle sat 2 remote properties. One belonged to a young man named Silas Mercer. The other belonged to a young woman named Ruth Crowley. Whitaker knew their names the way everyone in Perry County knew their names, which is to say he knew almost nothing real about them. Silas was 20 years old, tall and gaunt, with pale eyes that never seemed to blink at the right time. He had been raised in near total isolation after his father walked into the woods one winter and never came back. His mother died of fever 2 years later. By the time Silas was 15, he was alone on a failing farm, with nothing but timber and silence for company. Ruth Crowley was the same age, orphaned at 17 when both her parents succumbed to a sickness that swept through the hollow like a biblical plague. She lived alone on a farmstead so deep in the forest that most people forgot it existed. Neighbors who passed her property said the place felt wrong, though none of them could explain exactly what they meant by that. "She's odd," said a woman named Clara Boggs when Whitaker asked around. "Talks real soft, smiles real sweet, but there's something behind those eyes that don't match the smile, like she's watching you the way a cat watches a bird." Whitaker asked if anyone had ever seen Silas and Ruth together. Clara hesitated. "Once, I was coming back from my sister's place near the ridge, and I saw them standing at the edge of the tree line. Just standing there, not talking, not moving, just standing side by side, looking out at the trail like they were waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Whitaker asked. Clara shook her head. "That's what kept me up that night, Sheriff. I couldn't figure out what 2 people would be waiting for in the middle of nowhere, standing that still for that long." Whitaker filed the information away and kept digging. He talked to anyone who had interacted with either Silas or Ruth in the past 2 years. The stories were remarkably consistent. Both were polite. Both were quiet. Both appeared at odd times on trails and roads, offering directions, offering shelter, offering water. A man named Josiah Tanner told Whitaker something that made his stomach tighten. "I was riding through the hollow last October, and the girl appeared out of nowhere. I mean nowhere, Sheriff. One second the trail was empty, and the next she was standing there, smiling, telling me a storm was coming, and I should shelter at her place for the night." "Did you go?" Whitaker asked. Josiah shook his head slowly. "Something told me not to. I can't explain it better than that. Something in my gut just said, keep riding. So I did. I rode straight through the night and didn't stop until I was out of that hollow." He paused and looked at Whitaker with haunted eyes. "You think that girl is why those men are gone?" Whitaker did not answer, but he was already forming a plan. In April of 1857, a violent spring rainstorm hammered the mountains for 3 straight days. Creeks swelled, mud slid down hillsides. The earth opened up in places that had been solid for decades, and in a shallow creek bed half a mile from Ruth Crowley's property, the rain uncovered something that changed everything. A silver pocket watch. A farmer found it glinting in the mud and brought it to the sheriff's office. Whitaker turned it over in his hands and read the inscription on the back. "To Cornelius, with all my love, Martha." Cornelius Pratt, the first man to disappear. His wife's gift to him,
buried in mud within walking distance of Ruth Crowley's farm.
Whitaker's hands were shaking, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "James, get me 4 men, armed. We're going up to Black Hollow Ridge."
"When?" his deputy asked.
"Now." They rode up the next morning. Whitaker told his men to spread out and search every cave, every overhang, every crevice within a mile of the creek where the watch was found. He expected to find bones. He expected to find horror. What he found was worse. In a limestone cave set into the hillside, hidden behind a curtain of wild ivy, Whitaker discovered a chamber that stopped him in his tracks. Suitcases stacked neatly against the wall, clothing folded with care, Bibles arranged by size, personal keepsakes organized and cataloged on stone shelves, each one labeled with a small piece of paper tied with string. James Boone stepped in behind him and whispered, "Good Lord." Whitaker picked up one of the labels. It read in careful handwriting, H. Alcott, Doctor, November 1855. Henry Alcott, the doctor who rode out to treat typhoid and never arrived. Every item in that cave belonged to a missing man, and every item had been preserved with a kind of reverence that made Whitaker's skin crawl. This was not robbery. Robbers took what was valuable and destroyed the rest. This was something else entirely. This was a collection. "They're keeping trophies," James said, his voice cracking. "No," Whitaker said quietly. "Trophies are about pride. This is something different. This is organized. This is careful. This is like someone cataloging specimens." He stood in that cave for a long time, staring at 12 men's lives reduced to neatly arranged artifacts, and he understood with absolute certainty that whoever had done this was not driven by money or hate or politics or any of the familiar evils that plagued this divided land. This was something colder, something that had no name he knew, and it lived less than a mile from where he stood. That night, Whitaker sat alone in his office and made a decision that would either save lives or end his own. He would not raid the properties. He would not confront Silas and Ruth directly, because if he did, and the bodies were hidden somewhere he could not find them, they would walk free and disappear into the mountains like ghosts. He needed to catch them in the act. He needed bait. And God forgive him, he knew exactly how to set the trap. He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing a letter to a man in Lexington, a merchant who owed him a favor. The letter was simple and direct. "I need a brave man willing to ride into Black Hollow Ridge alone. He must look like a traveler. He must carry goods worth stopping for. And he must understand that what I am asking him to do may be the most dangerous thing he has ever done in his life." Whitaker sealed the letter and stared at the wall where 12 nails marked 12 lives swallowed by the mountains. "I'm coming for you," he whispered. But the mountains had been keeping secrets for a long time, and the 2 people at the center of those secrets had been perfecting their craft for nearly 2 years. Silas Mercer and Ruth Crowley were not finished, and the worst was still waiting beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse that smelled like chamomile tea and fresh-cut wood. The letter reached Lexington in 4 days. The merchant who owed Whitaker a favor was a man named Samuel Denton, 41 years old, a father of 3 who had survived cholera, a knife fight in Louisville, and 2 years of trading goods through territories where a white man without a gun was a dead man walking. Samuel read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and told his wife he had business in the mountains. She grabbed his arm. "What kind of business?" "The kind that needs doing," he said. She searched his face for something that would make her feel safe. She did not find it. Samuel rode out on May 20th, 1857, dressed like any ordinary traveling merchant heading south through the Appalachian trade routes. His mule carried bolts of fabric, a case of medicines, and a locked box that appeared to hold money but actually contained nothing but stones wrapped in cloth. On his hip sat a pistol Whitaker had given him. In his boot, a hunting knife, and in his chest, a fear he could not name but could feel pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Whitaker had been clear. You ride slow, you ride visible, you stop when someone asks you to stop, you accept hospitality if it is offered, and you stay alive long enough for me to get to you. And if you don't get to me in time, Samuel had asked. Whitaker looked him dead in the eye. Then I will bring your body home to your wife. That is my promise. It was not the comfort Samuel had hoped for, but he rode anyway, because 12 men were gone, and somebody had to be the 13th who fought back. He entered Black Hollow Ridge on the afternoon of May 22nd. The trail narrowed, the forest closed in. Samuel kept his eyes moving, scanning every shadow, every tree line, every bend in the path. His mule grew restless. Animals always knew before people did. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Samuel began to wonder if the whole plan was a fool's errand, if Whitaker had sent him into the wilderness to chase ghosts. Then, just as the afternoon light began to fade and the air turned cool, he heard a voice. "Sir? Excuse me, sir?" Samuel's hand dropped to his pistol. He turned in the saddle. Ruth Crowley stood at the edge of the trail, 20 feet away, wearing a plain cotton dress and an expression of such gentle concern that for one terrible moment, Samuel almost forgot why he was there. She was young, small. Her voice carried the soft mountain accent of someone raised far from towns and schoolhouses. She looked like a girl who needed help, not a girl who had helped kill 12 men. "Storm's coming," Ruth said, tilting her head slightly. "I can see it building over the ridge."
"You won't make it to the next settlement before dark."
Samuel swallowed. "I appreciate the concern, miss. My farmhouse is just down the hollow, 1/4 mile. You're welcome to shelter for the night. I've got tea and cornbread. It's no trouble." Everything about her was disarming. The posture, the timing, the way she positioned herself so that the fading light caught her face and made her look almost angelic. Samuel understood in that moment how 12 men had followed her willingly. She was not threatening. She was the opposite of threatening. She was the kind of person you trusted because your gut told you that something this gentle could not possibly be dangerous. But Samuel's gut was also screaming something else. Run. He did not run. He smiled and said, "That's mighty kind of you, miss. I'd be grateful." Ruth smiled back, and something behind her eyes shifted, just for a fraction of a second, like a door opening onto a dark room. Then it was gone, and she was just a girl again, leading him down a narrow path toward a farmhouse that smelled like chamomile and wood smoke. Whitaker was already in position. He had ridden up the ridge with 4 armed men before dawn and stationed them in the tree line surrounding Ruth's property. James Boone crouched behind a fallen oak 50 yards from the front door, his rifle steady, his breathing controlled. 2 more men covered the back. Whitaker himself sat on a rock outcropping with a clear line of sight to the farmhouse entrance, watching through a spyglass as Samuel Denton followed Ruth Crowley inside. "Come on," Whitaker muttered. "Show me what you are." Inside the farmhouse, Samuel sat at a wooden table, while Ruth prepared tea with movements so practiced and precise that they felt rehearsed. Every gesture was deliberate. The way she placed the cup, the way she positioned the chair so Samuel's back faced the rear door, the way she kept the conversation light and warm, asking about his travels, his goods, his family. Samuel played his part. He talked about his wife, his children. He mentioned the medicines he was carrying and how much they were worth. He watched Ruth's face for any reaction to the mention of value, any flash of greed. There was none. She did not care about his goods. She did not care about his money. She cared about something else entirely, and Samuel could feel it in the room,
like a change in air pressure before a storm. 15 minutes passed. Ruth poured a second cup of tea. Samuel noticed her eyes flick toward the back door. Once, twice, 3 times. She was waiting for someone. "Do you live here alone, miss?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice casual. "Mostly," Ruth said. "My cousin comes by sometimes. He helps with the heavy work." "That's so?" "Mm-hmm."
He should be along shortly, in fact. He'll be glad to meet you. He doesn't get many visitors. The back door opened. Silas Mercer stepped inside with the quiet of a man who had practiced silence his whole life. He was tall, thin, with hands that hung at his sides like tools waiting to be used. His pale eyes found Samuel immediately and held him with a gaze that contained no warmth, no curiosity, no hostility, just assessment, like a butcher evaluating a cut of meat. "Evening," Silas said. His voice was flat, toneless, like someone who had learned to speak by imitating sounds rather than understanding them. "Evening," Samuel replied. His hand was under the table now, resting on the pistol in his belt. Silas moved to the corner of the room, positioning himself between Samuel and the back door. Ruth remained between Samuel and the front door. The geometry was perfect, practiced. They had done this before, many times. Samuel's heart was hammering so hard he was certain they could hear it. He forced himself to breathe. He forced himself to smile. "Your cousin tells me a storm's coming," Samuel said to Silas. Silas did not look at the window. "It's already here," he said. Ruth set down her teacup with a soft click. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at her. Something passed between them that had no words. A communication built from 2 years of shared darkness, an understanding so complete that language was unnecessary. Silas took 1 step toward Samuel. And then the front door exploded inward. Whitaker came through first, pistol raised, voice like thunder. "Do not move, either of you." James Boone crashed through the back door a half-second later, rifle aimed at Silas's chest. 2 more men poured in through a side window, filling the small farmhouse with bodies and shouting and the sharp metallic sound of weapons being cocked. Ruth did not scream. She did not run. She did not even flinch. She simply stood there, teacup still in her hand, and looked at Whitaker with an expression of mild disappointment, as if he had interrupted something she had been looking forward to. Silas reacted differently. His body tensed like a coiled spring, and for 1 terrible heartbeat, Whitaker was certain the young man was going to lunge. But Silas looked at the 4 guns pointed at his body and made a calculation that even his broken mind could complete. He relaxed. His hands dropped to his sides, and he smiled. It was the smile that haunted Whitaker for the rest of his life. Not angry, not defeated, amused. As if the whole thing were a game, and he had simply lost this particular round. "Tie them," Whitaker ordered. "Hands and feet. And search this place, every room, every board, every inch."
Samuel Denton stood up from the table on shaking legs. His face was white. His hands trembled so violently he could not holster his pistol. He looked at Whitaker and said, "They were going to kill me. I could feel it. Like the air changed. Like the whole room turned into a trap and I was the animal inside it." Whitaker gripped his shoulder. "You did good, Samuel. You did real good." But the real horror had not yet revealed itself. It took James Boone 20 minutes to find the cellar. It was beneath the barn, hidden under a layer of straw and loose planks that had been fitted so precisely they appeared to be part of the original floor. James pried up the first plank and recoiled so violently he fell backward into the dirt. "Sheriff!" he shouted. "Sheriff, you need to see this!" Whitaker descended into the darkness with a lantern held high. The cellar was 8 feet deep, reinforced with hand-cut beams and fitted with iron hooks driven into the walls at intervals. Chains hung from the hooks. The chains were short,
designed to hold a man upright but immobile. Stains darkened the earth floor in patterns that told their own terrible story. And there, tucked beneath a loose stone in the corner, Whitaker found the notebook. He opened it with hands that did not want to cooperate. The first page was dated October 1855. The handwriting was neat, careful, almost elegant. It read, C. Pratt, merchant, approached on Eastern Trail at dusk, accepted shelter, compliant. Cornelius Pratt, the first man to vanish. Whitaker turned the pages. Each entry followed the same format, a name, an occupation, a description of how the victim was lured, notes on their behavior, and then a single word at the bottom of each entry that made Whitaker's blood freeze. Completed. The handwriting alternated between two hands. Some entries were written in Ruth's delicate script, others in Silas's blockier, more angular hand. They had taken turns. They had documented everything. Not with emotion, not with pride or remorse, with the flat, clinical detachment of someone recording weather patterns or crop yields. One entry described luring a doctor with promises of a sick child. Another noted that a hardware dealer had been resistant and required adjustment to the approach. A later entry referenced improvements to efficiency in the lower chamber. They were optimizing, refining their methods, getting better at killing the way a craftsman gets better at woodwork. Whitaker closed the notebook and stood in that cellar for a long time, breathing air that tasted like iron and earth, and something older than both. Above him, he could hear his men moving through the farmhouse. He could hear Ruth Crowley's voice, calm and measured, asking if someone could bring her a glass of water. He climbed out of the cellar and walked directly to where Ruth sat, tied to a chair. He held the notebook in front of her face. 12 men, he said. 12 families destroyed. Tell me why. Ruth looked at the notebook, then looked at Whitaker. Her expression did not change. Her breathing did not quicken. She studied him the way she had probably studied every man who sat at her table before the back door opened and Silas stepped through. Then she spoke. One sentence, the only sentence she would ever offer as explanation. The mountains are hungry. We were feeding what was always here. Whitaker stared at her. He waited for more, for context, for reason, for anything that would make sense of 12 dead men and a cellar fitted with chains. Ruth said nothing else. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the chair, and a small, strange smile crossed her lips, the kind of smile a person wears when they are remembering something pleasant. Whitaker turned away, because he could not look at that smile for one more second without losing something inside himself that he would never get back. Outside, the sky was darkening. A real storm was coming now, rolling over the ridgeline with thunder that shook the ground. Whitaker ordered his men to load both prisoners onto horses and ride for Hazard before the trails became impassable. As they led Silas out of the farmhouse, the young man turned his head and looked back at the building where he and Ruth had ended 12 lives. His expression was unreadable. Then he looked at Whitaker and spoke for the first time since his arrest. "You found the cave too, didn't you, Sheriff?" Whitaker said nothing. Silas nodded slowly. "Then you saw how carefully we kept their things. Every Bible, every letter, every photograph. We honored them, Sheriff. In our own way, we honored every single one." Whitaker's fist connected with Silas's jaw before he knew he had thrown the punch. Silas hit the ground hard, spat blood into the dirt, and laughed. It was a quiet, breathless laugh, the kind that comes from a place beyond fear or pain, from somewhere so deep and so dark that normal human emotions cannot reach it. James Boone pulled Whitaker back. "Not here, Sheriff, not like this. We do this right. We give them a trial. We give them a rope, and we let God sort out whatever is inside them." Whitaker straightened his coat. He looked at Silas on the ground, still smiling through bloody teeth.
He looked at Ruth on her horse, eyes closed, humming a melody so faint it was almost lost beneath the thunder. Two 20-year-olds, cousins raised in isolation, on the edge of a nation tearing itself apart over the question of whether one human being could own another. And here, in their own private kingdom of limestone and shadow, they had answered that question in the most horrifying way imaginable. Not with chains on a plantation, not with whips in a cotton field, but with tea and cornbread, and a cellar beneath a barn where men were reduced to entries in a notebook. The storm broke as they rode down the mountain.
Rain hammered the trail. Lightning split the sky above Black Hollow Ridge, and somewhere behind them, in a farmhouse that still smelled like chamomile, the cellar sat open and empty, waiting with the patience of something that had been hungry for a very long time. They reached Hazard before midnight, soaked through and shaking, the horses stumbling on trails turned to rivers of mud. Whitaker rode at the front. James Boone brought up the rear with his rifle trained on the two prisoners who sat their horses in silence, wrists bound, rain streaming down their faces. Silas had not spoken another word since Whitaker hit him. Ruth had not opened her eyes. The town was dark. Most folks had gone to bed hours ago. But word travels fast in small mountain communities, faster than horses, faster than storms, and by the time Whitaker's party crossed into Hazard proper, a small crowd had gathered near the jailhouse. Lanterns swung in the rain. Faces emerged from the darkness with expressions caught somewhere between fury and terror. A woman pushed through the crowd and grabbed Whitaker's arm before he could dismount. It was Martha Pratt, Cornelius's wife, the woman who had walked into his office 2 years ago with red eyes and trembling hands. "Is it them?" she demanded. "Thomas, tell me, is it them?" Whitaker looked at her. He thought about the notebook in his saddlebag. He thought about the entry that read, "C. Pratt, merchant, compliant." He thought about the word "completed" written beneath her husband's name in handwriting as neat as a schoolgirl's. "It's them, Martha." Martha Pratt's face collapsed. Not with relief, not with satisfaction, with a grief so total that it remade her features into something Whitaker barely recognized. She had spent 2 years hoping that Cornelius was alive somewhere, lost, injured, maybe taken by slavers heading south, maybe wandering with no memory of who he was. Any explanation, no matter how terrible, was better than the one she now faced. Her husband had been lured into a farmhouse by a 20-year-old girl, documented in a notebook like livestock, and disposed of so completely that not even his bones remained. Martha looked at Ruth Crowley, sitting calmly on her horse, rain dripping from her chin, eyes still closed, and she let out a sound that Whitaker would hear in his nightmares for decades. It was not a scream. It was not a cry. It was something between the two, a sound that came from a place in the human body where language has no authority, where grief is so raw that it bypasses the throat and erupts directly from the chest. "Lock them up," Whitaker ordered. "Nobody goes near them, nobody talks to them, nobody touches them. We do this by the law." "Law?" a man in the crowd shouted. "What law protects people like that? String them up tonight and be done with it." A rumble of agreement rolled through the crowd. Whitaker understood the impulse. In 1857 Kentucky, mob justice was not unusual. Across the slave-holding South, men were hanged from trees without trial for offenses real and imagined. The entire system of slavery was built on violence without due process, on the idea that some people did not deserve the protection of law. Whitaker had watched that poison eat through his state for his entire life, and he refused to let it eat through this. "We are not a mob," he shouted, and his voice cut through the rain and the anger like a blade. "We are not slavers, dragging a man behind a horse because we decided he deserved it. We have evidence. We have a notebook full of names.
We have a cellar fitted with chains, and we will present that evidence in a court of law, and a jury of citizens will decide what justice looks like. That is what separates us from them." He pointed at Silas and Ruth. "That is what separates us from what they did in that hollow." The crowd went quiet, not convinced, not satisfied, but shamed enough to step aside as Whitaker's men led the prisoners into the jailhouse and locked the heavy iron door behind them. June 1857. The weeks before the trial became their own kind of torment. Whitaker worked 18-hour days building the case. He sent men back to Black Hollow Ridge to catalog every item in the limestone cave. He dispatched letters to the families of the missing, asking them to identify belongings. He hired a lawyer from Lexington to prosecute because no local attorney wanted the burden of standing in front of a courtroom and describing what had been found in that cellar. The responses from families arrived one by one, and each one broke Whitaker a little more. Henry Alcott's widow identified her husband's medical bag and the stethoscope she had given him as a wedding gift. She wrote, "Please tell me he did not suffer. Even if it is a lie, please tell me that." Whitaker did not write back. He did not know how to lie that convincingly. The hardware dealer's brother traveled from Virginia to identify a toolbox and a pair of leather gloves. He sat in Whitaker's office and wept without shame, a grown man sobbing into his hands while the sheriff stood helpless, holding a dead man's gloves. "Did they say why?" the brother asked. "The girl said the mountains were hungry," Whitaker replied. The brother looked at him with red, swollen eyes. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know. I've been asking myself the same question every night for 3 weeks, and I don't know." Meanwhile, Silas and Ruth sat in adjacent cells separated by a stone wall. Whitaker posted guards around the clock, not because he feared the prisoners would escape, but because he feared the townspeople would break in and kill them before the trial. 3 times in June, armed groups approached the jailhouse after dark. 3 times, Whitaker stood on the steps with a shotgun and turned them away. "You hang them without a trial. You become what this state already is," he told one group. "A place where power decides who lives and who dies. I won't allow it. Not in my county." The leader of the group, a farmer named Virgil Combs, whose brother-in-law was among the missing, spat on the ground and said, "You're protecting murderers, Thomas." "I'm protecting the law, Virgil. And if the law says they hang, they'll hang. But it will be the law that says it, not you and not me." Virgil left, but Whitaker slept in the jailhouse that night, and every night after, with his shotgun across his knees. During those weeks, something happened that Whitaker had not anticipated. Silas began to talk, not to the guards, not to the attorneys, to Whitaker. Only to Whitaker. And only at night, after the lanterns were dimmed and the jailhouse settled into the heavy silence of stone and iron. "Sheriff," Silas said one night through the bars, "you want to understand. I can see it eating you alive." Whitaker was sitting in a chair by the door. He did not move. He did not respond. "You think there's a reason," Silas continued. "Something that makes sense. Something you can write in a report and file away and tell yourself that's why they did it. But there isn't one, Sheriff. There's no reason that would satisfy you." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "Try me." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father disappeared when I was 13. Just walked into the woods and never came back. My mother told me the mountain took him. She said it like it was a fact, like saying the rain fell or the creek rose. The mountain took him. And after she died, I was alone up there for 2 years, Sheriff. 2 years without hearing another human voice. Do
Do you know what that does to a person? Whitaker said nothing. It empties you out, Silas said, like pouring water from a jar. Everything that makes you human, the guilt, the empathy, the fear of God, it drains out of you one day at a time until there's nothing left but the sound of the wind and the feeling that something out there in the dark is waiting.
And then you meet someone who was emptied out the same way, and you realize that together, the emptiness becomes something else, something with purpose.
Purpose, Whitaker repeated, and the word tasted like poison in his mouth. Ruth lost everyone the same year I did. Fever took her whole family in 6 weeks. She buried her mother, her father, and her baby sister by herself, dug the graves with her own hands. She was 17.
And when she was done burying them, she sat on the porch and waited to die herself. But she didn't die. The mountain wouldn't let her. The mountain didn't kill those men, Silas. You did. You and Ruth. We did what the mountain asked. The mountain doesn't talk. Whitaker's voice cracked the silence like a whip. He stood up, his chair scraping against the stone floor. Mountains don't ask. Mountains don't want. You killed 12 men because something inside you is broken. And you dressed it up in superstition because you can't face what you really are. Silas pressed his face against the bars. His pale eyes caught the faint lantern light and held it. Then what are we, Sheriff? You've been in that cellar. You've read every page of that notebook. You've held those men's belongings in your hands. So tell me, what are we? Whitaker stared at him. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. He could not answer it. Not then. Not ever. From the other side of the wall, Ruth's voice drifted through the silence, barely above a whisper. He can't answer because there is no word for it, Silas. There never was. July 4th, 1857. The trial date was chosen deliberately. Independence Day. A statement from the court that American justice applied even here, even in the mountains, even in a nation rotting from the inside with the sin of slavery. The message was clear. If the law could reach into Black Hollow Ridge and hold 2 killers accountable, then perhaps the law still meant something in a country where 4 million human beings were held in chains. The tent courtroom was erected in a field outside Hazard because no building in town was large enough. Over 300 people traveled from across Perry County and beyond. Families of the victims sat in the front row, clutching handkerchiefs and photographs. Martha Pratt wore black. She had not worn another color since the night Whitaker told her the truth. Judge Amos Whitfield, a circuit rider who covered 5 mountain counties, presided. He was 62 years old and had seen enough violence to fill several lifetimes, but even he paused when he read the charges. 12 counts of murder, conspiracy, desecration. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly, and put them back on, as if hoping the words might change. They did not. Silas was brought in first. He walked with his wrists chained and his head high, scanning the crowd with those flat, pale eyes. When he passed Martha Pratt, he stopped. The guards pulled him forward, but for one moment, his gaze locked with hers. Martha did not look away. She held his stare with the full force of a woman who had buried an empty coffin and told her children their father was with God when she did not know if that was true. Silas blinked first. It was the only time anyone ever saw him yield. Ruth entered next. She was smaller than most people expected, thin and pale, with dark hair pulled back tightly. She moved through the crowd without looking at anyone, her expression blank, her hands still. She sat beside Silas and folded her bound hands in her lap, and she did not move again for the entire first day of testimony. The prosecutor, a Lexington attorney named Charles Beaumont, opened with the notebook. He held it up so the entire tent could see it.
This small, leather-bound record of 12 murders documented with the precision of a bookkeeper. "What I hold in my hand," Beaumont said, "is not a diary. It is not a confession. It is an inventory. An inventory of human beings treated as objects to be acquired, processed, and catalogued. In a nation that already catalogues human beings for sale on auction blocks, these two defendants created their own private system of ownership. Not for profit,
Not for ideology, for reasons they themselves cannot or will not explain. He opened the notebook and began reading names. Cornelius Pratt, merchant. Martha's hands clenched in her lap. Henry Alcott, doctor. A woman in the third row pressed a handkerchief to her face. William Sykes, hardware dealer. A man sitting alone in the back row lowered his head. Beaumont read all 12 names, slowly, deliberately. Each name falling into the tent like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of grief through the crowd. When he finished, the tent was silent. 300 people breathing together in shared horror. And at the defense table, Ruth Crowley sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, her lips barely moving, as if she were counting something that only she could hear. The trial lasted 3 days.
3 days of testimony that stripped the courtroom bare of whatever innocence anyone had carried into it. Witness after witness took the stand, and each one added another layer to a portrait so disturbing that Judge Whitfield twice called for recesses because members of the jury had become physically ill. Josiah Tanner, the traveler who had refused Ruth's invitation the previous October, testified with his hat crushed between his hands. His voice shook as he described the moment she appeared on the trail, the sweetness of her voice, the way every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep riding. "She looked like somebody's daughter," Josiah said. "Somebody's little girl, lost out there in the woods. And I almost stopped. God forgive me, I almost followed her. If I had, I wouldn't be standing here today." Beaumont asked him, "What stopped you, Mr. Tanner?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment. "Her eyes," he said. Her mouth was smiling, but her eyes weren't. Her eyes were doing something else entirely. Something I'd only ever seen once before in my life, in a wolf watching a rabbit from the tree line. Patient. That's the word. She was patient, like something that had all the time in the world. Clara Boggs took the stand next and described seeing Silas and Ruth standing side by side at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching the trail. "I asked my husband later why it bothered me so much," Clara said, "and he told me I was being foolish. But I wasn't foolish. I was right. I knew something was wrong with those two, the way you know milk has turned before you taste it. Something in the air around them was spoiled." Samuel Denton testified last among the civilian witnesses. He recounted every detail of the evening he spent in Ruth's farmhouse, the careful choreography of the trap, the tea, the positioning, the way Silas appeared at the back door and slid into place with the silence of a man who had done it 100 times. "When Silas stepped between me and that door," Samuel told the jury, "I understood what every one of those 12 men felt in their last moments. I understood what it's like to realize you've walked into a cage and the door just closed. The terror isn't in the violence. The terror is in the calm. Those two were calm the way a Sunday morning is calm, like what they were about to do was the most natural thing in the world." Beaumont then called Sheriff Whitaker. Thomas took the stand carrying the notebook and a sack containing items recovered from the limestone cave. He placed both on the evidence table and began his testimony with the steadiness of a man who had rehearsed every word because he knew if he did not control his voice, he would lose it entirely. He described the cave,
the suitcases stacked with care, the Bibles arranged by size, the personal effects labeled and catalogued with handwritten tags. He held up Cornelius Pratt's silver pocket watch, and Martha, in the front row, pressed both hands over her mouth.
"This watch," Whitaker said, "was the only reason we found anything at all. 2 years of rain could not keep it buried. 2 years of silence could not keep the truth underground. It surfaced the way the truth always surfaces, not because anyone was clever enough to find it, but because the earth itself refused to hold it any longer." He then described the cellar beneath Ruth's barn, the chains, the hooks, the stains on the floor that the county doctor confirmed were consistent with human blood. Several jurors looked away. One closed his eyes and did not open them again until Whitaker finished speaking. Finally, Whitaker opened the notebook to a page near the back and read a single entry aloud. Entry 11. Methodist preacher. Approached with offer of shelter. Accepted tea. Showed no suspicion. Transition smooth. Improvements from previous attempt applied successfully. Completed. He closed the notebook and looked directly at Silas and Ruth. Improvements, he repeated. They used the word improvements, as if they were perfecting a recipe, as if these men's lives were practice rounds for something they wanted to get right. The defense attorney, a reluctant public advocate named Hiram Foster, who had been appointed by the court because no one else would take the case, rose to present his argument. He was a thin man with tired eyes who understood before the trial began that his clients would hang, and that his only job was to ensure the legal process was honored so that no appeal could ever undo what the jury decided. Foster did not argue innocence. He could not. The notebook alone was a signed confession written in 2 hands across 2 years. Instead, he argued insanity, and he did so with a sincerity that surprised even Whitaker. "These 2 young people," Foster told the jury, "were destroyed long before they destroyed anyone else. Silas Mercer lost his father to the wilderness at 13 and his mother to fever at 15. He spent 2 years alone on a mountain with no human contact, no church, no school, no family, nothing but silence and survival. Ruth Crowley buried her mother, her father, and her infant sister in the span of 6 weeks when she was 17 years old. She dug the graves herself because there was nobody left to help her." Foster paused and looked at the jury with something close to pleading. "I am not asking you to forgive them. I am asking you to understand that the Appalachian frontier in this era, in this divided and brutal nation, produces horrors not because the people born here are evil, but because the conditions we force upon them are inhuman. We live in a country that chains 4 million souls in bondage and calls it commerce. We live in a country where children are sold away from their mothers, and we call it property rights. Is it so impossible to believe that this same country, this same land, this same system of abandonment and cruelty could produce 2 young people so shattered by isolation and loss that they became something we do not have a name for?" The tent was silent. Foster's words hung in the humid July air, and for a moment, even the victims' families seemed to feel the weight of what he was saying. Not agreement, not sympathy, but recognition that the world that produced Silas and Ruth was the same world that held millions in chains, the same world that whipped men for learning to read, the same world that measured human worth in pounds of cotton picked per day. Beaumont rose for his rebuttal. He was brief. "The defense asks us to blame the mountains, to blame isolation, to blame the sins of a broken nation. But 12 men are dead. 12 families are destroyed." And the 2 people responsible documented their crimes with the same careful attention a plantation owner uses to document his slaves. Motive does not matter. Method does. And the method was calculated, deliberate,
and repeated 12 times over 2 years. The prosecution rests. July 7th, 1857. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 43 minutes. When they filed back into the tent, not one of them looked at the defendants. Whitaker knew what that meant. He had seen enough verdicts to read a jury's body language the way a sailor reads the wind. The foreman stood. Judge Whitfield asked for the verdict. "Guilty," the foreman said, "on all counts, for both defendants." No one in the tent reacted. No cheers, no gasps. The verdict had been inevitable from the moment Whitaker opened that notebook, and everyone knew it. The only sound was Martha Pratt exhaling, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry 2 years of waiting out of her body. Judge Whitfield set the execution for August 23rd, 1857. He asked both defendants if they wished to make a statement. Silas stood. His chains rattled against the wooden floor. He looked at the jury, then at the crowd, then at Whitaker, and then, one by one, he answered. "Cornelius Pratt?" Beaumont read from the charges. "Yes," Silas said. "Henry Elcott?" "Yes." "William Sykes?" "Yes." 12 names, 12 times, Silas said yes. His voice never wavered, his expression never changed. He confirmed each murder the way a man confirms items on a grocery list, with flat, total certainty and no visible emotion. When the last name was read, Silas sat down. Ruth did not stand. She did not speak. She had not spoken a single word since the night of her arrest, since she told Whitaker the mountains were hungry. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed and that faint, terrible smile on her lips, and she gave the court nothing. August 22nd, 1857. The night before the hanging. A storm rolled in from the west, the worst anyone could remember. Lightning cracked across the ridgeline, so bright it turned midnight into noon. Thunder shook the jailhouse walls. Rain hammered the roof in sheets so heavy the guards had to shout to be heard. Whitaker sat in his chair outside the cells, unable to sleep, unwilling to leave. At some point past 2 in the morning, Silas spoke from the darkness. "Do you hear that, Sheriff?" "It's a storm, Silas, nothing more. It's the mountain. It knows what's coming tomorrow. It's angry. The mountain doesn't feel anything. Then why are you shaking?" Whitaker looked down at his hands. They were trembling. He pressed them flat against his knees and said nothing. From the other cell, Ruth's voice came through the wall, clear and calm. "Sheriff Whitaker, I want to thank you." Whitaker felt something cold move through his chest. "Thank me for what?" "For catching us. I was tired, Sheriff."
Silas won't admit it, but I will. I was tired. The mountain's hunger never stops. It just keeps wanting. And we kept feeding it because we didn't know how to stop. You stopped us, and tomorrow it will be over. Whitaker leaned forward. "Ruth, there is no mountain spirit. There is no hunger. You killed those men because something inside you is broken." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe. Or maybe something inside us was the only part that was working. The part that heard what nobody else could hear. You'll never know, Sheriff. And that will haunt you longer than it haunts us." August 23rd, 1857. Dawn. The storm had passed, but the air still tasted like electricity. The gallows had been built in the same field where the trial took place. Over 500 people gathered. Families, farmers, strangers from 3 counties away who had heard the story and come to watch it end. Silas walked to the gallows first. His steps were steady. His face was blank. When asked for final words, he looked out at the crowd and spoke in a voice that carried across the field without effort. "The mountains will remember." Ruth was led out next. She was so small that the hangman had to adjust the rope.
She stood on the platform and opened her eyes for the first time in what felt like days. She looked at the sky. She looked at the ridgeline. And then she looked directly at Whitaker, who stood 15 feet away with his hat in his hands.
"And they do not forgive," she said.
The trapdoors opened simultaneously. The ropes snapped tight. Instant death for both. 500 people stood in silence. No one cheered, no one prayed. The only sound was the creak of rope and the distant echo of thunder rolling through hollows that had kept their secrets for 2 years and would keep them forever. Whitaker watched the bodies hang motionless against the morning sky. He thought about 12 men who would never come home.
He thought about Martha Pratt burying an empty coffin. He thought about Ruth's last words and the terrible possibility that she was right, that not knowing why would haunt him longer than any answer ever could. He put his hat on and walked away. Search parties spent the next 3 months combing Black Hollow Ridge. They found the cave, they found the cellar, they found the notebook and the belongings and every carefully preserved artifact of 12 stolen lives. But they never found a single body, not one bone, not one grave. The victims of Silas Mercer and Ruth Crowley simply ceased to exist, swallowed by limestone and shadow and whatever lived in the spaces between. Historians would struggle with the case for decades. These were not plantation killers enforcing racial terror, not bandits motivated by profit, not political radicals or religious fanatics.
They were 2 orphaned cousins, emptied by grief and isolation, who turned the Appalachian wilderness into a private killing ground during one of the most morally catastrophic periods in American history. In a century that commodified human beings by the millions, that built an economy on the flesh of enslaved men and women and children, the crimes of Silas and Ruth were almost too intimate, too personal, too methodical to fit into any historical narrative.
They did not kill for power or money or ideology.
They killed because something inside them had been hollowed out by a world that did not care whether they lived or died. And into that hollow space, something else had moved in. Something that had no name. Something the mountains recognized. Textbooks would never mention them. Official records would crumble and fade. But in eastern Kentucky, in the hollows around Black Hollow Ridge, the old folks still tell the story.
They say that certain trails go quiet at dusk, that birds stop singing near the ridge, that if you stand still long enough in the right spot, you can feel something watching you from the tree line with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world. And if you are ever offered tea by a stranger on a mountain trail, the old folks will tell you the same thing Josiah Tanner's gut told him on that October afternoon in 1856. Keep riding. Do not stop. The mountains are still hungry. And they do not forgive.